Philosophy. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. On his deathbed, the philosopher Hegel lamented, "There is only one man who truly understood me," he sighed tired and strained. It was a peculiar statement from a philosopher who was finally admired and celebrated late in life. He was considered Prussia's state philosopher, was decorated by Emperor Frederick William III, and officials, nobles, officers, and young intellectuals from all over Europe came to hear the lectures he held between 12 and 1 p.m. at the University of Berlin. Along with Friedrich Schleiermacher's grand sermons in the Holy Trinity Church and the actor Ludwig de Vriend's spectacular performances in the theater, Hegel's lectures were one of the attractions people talked about in Berlin. In 1831, he was the leading thinker in Prussia, which at the time was a cultural center and, due to its strong bureaucracy and effective state, a political model. History does not say who this one man who had understood Hegel was supposed to be. But it doesn't really matter, because shortly after he added, "And even he did not understand me." And then Hegel died, at 61 years old. Ever since, students and curious young people, philosophers, intellectuals, Marxists, and conservatives have tried to do what, according to him, no one had managed to do during his lifetime: understand Hegel. It is also difficult. His friend, the poet king of the era and generous patron when the philosopher could not pay his bills, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, once said jokingly that one would do Hegel a considerable service if they taught him a little rhetorical technique. Hegel used unusual concepts to unfold his thoughts and made sentences so long and twisted that even scholars got lost when trying to find their way through subclauses, additions, and leaps of thought. And when Hegel lectured, he often interrupted himself, coughed, and usually spoke with snuff in his mouth. But it is neither his language nor his style that makes Hegel difficult to understand. It is his ambition. Hegel wanted to develop a philosophical system that would grasp the whole of his time and thought. He wanted to uncover all the individual moments and phenomena in society, but he also wanted to present the whole. Hegel is not the first philosopher who belongs to the modern period, writes Jürgen Habermas, but he is the first for whom the modern has become a problem. It is a problem that cannot or should not be solved. But problem formulation is a way to understand the reason, relationships, conflicts, and efforts in our reality. And since no one has formulated the problem better than Hegel, you get a unique understanding of our history. These were revolutionary years. In Germany, a revolution was taking place in the world of ideas that were to change thinking forever. In France, a social and political revolution took place that changed our society forever. Immanuel Kant had in his thinking smashed the entire tradition called metaphysics by exposing how people ask questions they cannot answer themselves. Does the world have a beginning? Does man have free will? Kant stated that man cannot know everything and in this way set a limit on our knowledge. He radically separated reason and nature, our knowledge and our world. But his confrontation with metaphysics was also a liberation because it required a rational critique of all accepted truths and dogmas. Kant wanted to rebuild all our knowledge from scratch. Similarly, the French Revolution pulled down all political authorities that could not be justified rationally, abolished the monarchy, and founded the French Republic. The revolution culminated in the declaration that all citizens must be guaranteed the right to liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. When the young Hegel 1788 came to Tübingen to study theology at Eberhard Karl's University, he experienced the contrast between the old society's authoritarian institutions and the young people's enthusiasm for the spiritual and political upheavals in Europe. The college's motto was punctuality, precision, accuracy, and students had to get up at 6 o'clock every morning for a sermon and hymn singing. But they were politically intoxicated when rumors of the revolution in 1789 reached Tübingen. Hegel read banned French newspapers, sang the Marseillaise, and joined secret societies where they shouted "Vive la liberté." He lived in Tübingen in a unique boarding house for young geniuses. But no one knew that at the time, because the intellectual, searching, and romantic young men were still unknown. From 1788, Hegel shared a dorm room with a young man named Friedrich Hölderlin, who today is considered one of the most important German poets of all time, and in 1790, the only 15-year-old Friedrich von Schelling, who later became a formative idealistic philosopher, moved in with them. Together, they were to shape the poetry, thinking, and culture of the next centuries. At night, they drank wine, discussed, read aloud to each other, and together wrote a manifesto for German idealism. They were convinced that they lived in a period when mankind would achieve great advances. The conflicts of the modern. The major themes of Hegel's philosophy are already hinted at in the community with Schelling and Hölderlin. He is a passionate supporter of the French Revolution, but also aware that revolution can turn into terror, emptiness, and egoism. He, therefore, wants to recreate what he then called a people's religion, an organic community like the one he knew from antiquity. He was inspired by Kant's radical reason, but he could not accept the separation of reason and the world. Hegel understood that in love, the heart is the place of truth. But he also wrote that anyone who appeals to the emotions as an oracle rejects all who disagree. He declares that he has nothing to say to anyone who is unable to feel the same and find the same things inside themselves as he does. In other words, he tramples on the roots of our common humanity. Thus, Hegel is also a rationalist. He believes in reason. His starting point is the assumption that the modern is not a program or a unified theory of the world. According to Hegel, the modern is characterized by conflicts between the freedom of the individual and the concern for the community, between the individual's right and common sense, between romanticism and rationalism, between capitalism that creates wealth but also leads to alarming inequality, and a state that is based on rules and equality and rights. For Hegel, freedom is three different things that are in conflict but also mutually dependent: freedom of the individual from oppression and from one's own nature, freedom to do what is reasonable, and freedom to act together with others as we. No person can be free alone. This is why Hegel is both a supporter of the liberation of the revolution and of the strong state, which for him is the place of freedom. These conflicts cannot be abolished, they can be mediated. It is the play and tensions between them that, according to Hegel, drive society forward. And it is their study of them that developed Hegel's own thinking. When the young Hegel completed his studies in 1793, he broke away from the brilliant three-person group and left Tübingen. His teachers had no idea that he would develop into an influential thinker. They wrote in an evaluation that he was not without skills in philology, but he certainly does not seem promising in philosophy. Like many other rebellious intellectuals in the 1790s, Hegel saw himself as an educator of the people. He wanted to enlighten the public, fight superstition and dogma, and prepare citizens for life in a free republic based on civic virtues and high ideals. It was unthinkable for him to become a professional philosopher at a university. For many years, he lived as a tutor in wealthy families in Bern and Frankfurt. But after his father's death, he applied for a position at the University of Jena in 1801. He could not live on his salary, so he could not start a family, and he often had to borrow money from his friends. At that time, he had written several minor but insignificant works for the public. In October 1806, Napoleon's French army occupied Jena, and Hegel noticed how even the Prussian soldiers looked up to the French. He was fascinated by how Napoleon could submit his opponents by his mere presence. "It is truly a wonderful feeling to see such an individual," Hegel wrote later in a letter, "who is gathered in one place, sitting on his horse, reaching out over the whole world and controlling it." Shortly after, Hegel published The Phenomenology of Spirit, which today stands as his definitive masterpiece. The unity he had previously sought in the people's religion, and the dream of a union between the individual and the community, which he had imagined as a connection between the modern revolution and the ancient city-state, he now shifted to history. He imagined a world spirit that realizes itself through people in history. Spirit is nothing in itself, but a product of people's joint efforts in different periods. According to Hegel, man is a kind of vehicle for a world spirit that he himself does not know. When we thus do our best to realize ourselves as loving members of a family, consumers, and producers in the market, citizens of the state and participants in public discourse, we also realize, without knowing it, a larger community. Hegel calls it reason's trick that it realizes itself through people's actions and works. It may sound mythic and metaphysical. But if we replace the word world spirit with the idea of progress, isn't it still the case today that we give meaning to our actions by fulfilling certain roles, such as loving partners, responsible citizens, and competent professionals, and that in doing so, we also contribute to the greater good of society? In the following years, Hegel struggled to find work that would pay him enough to be able to think, write, and start a family. He worked as an editor for a local newspaper in Bamberg for a year before becoming a rector at a high school in Nuremberg. He had a child with his housekeeper, whom he left behind and couldn't afford to support at times. His mother died, and the boy was placed in an orphanage. When Hegel finally married Marie von Tucker, 20 years his junior, at the age of 41, he took the boy with him. After a brief time as a teacher in Heidelberg, he was appointed as a professor of philosophy at the University of Berlin in 1818. Here he lived the life he had strived for throughout his life. He attended concerts and the theater with his wife, and they frequented the city's liberal cultural elite. He eagerly traveled to Vienna, Amsterdam, and, finally, Paris, which he excitedly referred to as the capital of the civilized world in a letter to his wife. Thanks for watching. Please consider subscribing.